Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this version of Publics at IIHS. My name is Neha Sami. I'm one of the faculty here at IIHS, and I'm delighted to introduce a really, really exciting and interesting panel today. We have a set of very interesting speakers that brings together contributors of the special feature City Drafting, published in the journal City. I'll leave the speakers to introduce themselves, but the panel will be moderated by Indivar and Tom. And so without much delay, I'll hand it over to you guys. Thank you all very much for being here and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nia. Yeah, I'd just like to thank the team at IIHS for inviting us to discuss the special feature on city drafting that was published earlier this year. It's a real privilege for us to be invited and to kind of have this discussion at IIHS, albeit virtually. I did try and push for a Bangalore reunion. The research produced here at the Institute, and indeed like the broader literature that's come out of the city of Bangalore, has been so instructive to our collective thinking on city drafting and bureaucratic urbanism. And indeed, we have a paper that's drawn from fieldwork in the city. So thanks to everyone. And I'll be co-chairing today's session with my co-editor of this special feature, Dr. Indivar Jonalagada, who's an assistant professor of international studies at the Miami University, Ohio. And we're really lucky today to be joined by all of the contributors to the special feature, and I'll be asking those to introduce themselves just in a moment's time. So I'm going to start by briefly introducing some of the kind of key concepts and contributions that the special feature on city drafting aims to make and explain a little bit about what we mean by city drafting specifically. Then we'll move on to asking the panel to introduce themselves and provide a very brief summary of the key claims of their paper before we go into a panel discussion which draws on some of the key themes that arise across the papers in the collection. We should have around 20 minutes, I think, towards the end of the session to open up for questions, which you can put in the Q&A box, and we'll address those towards the end. Okay, so the idea behind the special feature on city drafting really started life as a set of conversations between Indivar and I back in 2021 regarding how we might rethink urbanism and urban theory from the vernacular property-making practices of the bureaucracy. It was apparent from our respective fieldwork in Hyderabad and in Gurgaon that it was in these pluralistic and caste-embellished bureaucratic spaces that urban property was coming to life through ledgers, notings, WhatsApp groups, and was shaping this kind of contentious and uneven geography of the South Asian city. A focus on these messy bureaucratic practices, we argue in the special feature, allows us to move beyond some of the more unhelpful dichotomies that besiege urban studies between the formal and informal, code and practice, the modern and archaic, and so on and so on, and draws us into the spaces and practices through which the social, and in our case, the city, can be viewed as drafted. City drafting as a concept, of course, has its provenance in an extensive and influential body of work across South Asian studies that has long emphasized the centrality of the vernacular or the porous bureaucracy to brokering political, economic, and social formations in post-colonial South Asia. This collective body of work, which extends from agrarian studies to Marxist historiography to urban anthropology, has emphasized how state space straddles formal, modernist, and vernacular institutions, mediating the competing demands of the citizens and the people, the nation and community, capital and the state, and in doing so gives life to altogether different kinds of political relations and territorial logics. And so city drafting has always in part been our way of building on that tradition and directing its methodologies, consolidating its analytical contributions to re-examine South Asian urbanism more broadly. In doing so, I think all the papers in the special feature pay particular attention to the work bureaucracies do to assemble, improvise, and authorize property relations against approaches that sort of foreground automated planning epistemologies and Weberian state structures, and perhaps presume the primacy of private property relations. In city drafting, across the selection of papers, we pay attention to the contested work required to haul diverse land and property relations across competing modernist, communitarian, and capitalist forms. This city drafting, we argue, is firstly, this property drafting, I should say, is firstly ideological, and many of the papers draw on this kind of longer liberal history, which has yoked property settlement to racialized, gendered, and casteist pathologies of propriety. Property drafting is secondly material. It requires the convincing mobilization of deeds, signatures, maps, and fences that can together perform the legitimate look and feel of a property claim. And many of the papers also touch on how property drafting is recursive and improvisational. It requires technologies able to stretch and bend property to accommodate competing territorial claims, requiring the deft redrawing of boundary lines, the retuning of spatial regulations, reclassification of tenure, distribution of titles, and so on, that provisionally settle urban space. And despite South Asia's sort of much discussed real estate turn, part of the contribution of the special feature is really to argue that private property doesn't fall from the sky, nor is it assured by the desires of powerful state and real estate actors. Rather, property relations in the South Asian city, we argue, are more usefully understood as drafted, constructed through provisional assembly of paperwork, plots, and power. Drafting practices as such might be utilized by development actors to reconfigure diverse land tenures into the singular vernacular of private real estate, but might also be put to work to block capitalist subsumption of space and extend non-privatized property forms. And really, part of the point of examining city drafting is to explore that empirical question as to how these bureaucratic spaces are being put to work within particular conjunctures. So finally, in today's panel discussion, we were really interested in thinking about the kind of aggregate and networked effects of this drafting for how we understand the urban more broadly. And in particular, we're interested in bringing our collective work on city drafting to consider some of the immediate challenges facing South Asian cities, asking how drafting practices might be being utilized in a politics of state violence, of state formation, land grabs, real estate development, how drafting might sustain alternative and ulterior modes of urbanism, and what role drafting might play in delivering core urban policy objectives. So that's my brief summing up of some of the core themes. I'm going to pass you over to Indiva now, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the brilliant summary and setting us up, I think, for a great conversation. So I'm going to call on the panelists in order in which your papers appear in the special issue. And please step in and introduce yourself briefly and talk a little bit about how city drafting operates in your work, maybe drawing from your paper. So fittingly, we'll begin with Shubhra Gururani, whose work on flexible planning also was instrumental to what we're doing here. Shubhra.
Thank you so much to IIHS and of course to Tom and Indiva for putting together the collection and for also bringing us together in this post-publication conversation. So good to see you virtually. As you know, I'm Shubhra Gururani. I'm an anthropologist by training based in York University. I've been working on the making of urban peripheries in India for the last 15 or so years, focusing on Gurgaon. And as someone who comes to the urban question from agrarian studies, political ecology, and environmental movement, my earlier work, I'm interested in questions of how agrarian relations of land, property, class, caste, and cattle endure amid extensive urbanization. I've conducted extensive fieldwork among city and regional planners, real estate agents, smallholders, and written about flexibility. And I think that's a conversation which we are going to have further. And contingency that is written into the plan or the draft, as Tom and Endeavor argue. And in thinking through the practice of city planning, city drafting, which I find very compelling and generative, I have been drawn to this aspect of city making precisely because it is not exactly the small group of subaltern residents, the migrants or the urban poor, who surreptitiously encroach or occupy the city. But city, as the special issue argues, is drafted at the level of the state, at the level of bureaucracy, at all levels and scale above and below. And in my own paper in this collection, I focus on a select group of actors whom I call figures, the real estate agents, brokers, dalals, gurus, and babas, and present a brief snapshot of how do the work of making property agrarian property urban. And in doing so, my goal is to highlight multiple entanglements of caste, place, and power that are historically sedimented in colonial and sometimes pre-colonial contexts, and how they contour the urban in the contemporary political conjuncture. So that's where I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a wonderful summary. Next, I'll call on Varun Patil.
Thank you. Thank you, IIHS. So I'm a sociologist. I've been working from the past 6 years on the issues of access to land and housing in India, especially to lower and middle income groups. My focus has been mainly to interrogate the knowledges or the epistemological underpinnings of developmental policy driving contemporary renewal, which often cuts across ideologies, concepts such as informality, property, corruption, planning, and redevelopment. So instead, through ethnography and using anthropological concepts, I question these taken for granted concepts used to analyze urban transformation. I was drawn or house through the for city drafting concept basically for two things. One is that it kind of brings out the agential aspect of the urban poor, the lower and middle income groups in the contemporary urbanization process. Secondly, it kind of also shows the kind of hollowness of the de jure property regimes, or what we call as the mainstream property regimes, by showing that de facto tenures have a stability. So I was really attracted by this. My own work in Bangalore has really focused on how it has focused on the spatial form of revenue layouts, especially on Bangalore Development Authority notified lands, and how do these people, many of them lower income groups, settle on these lands, and through using city drafting practices at all scales, consolidate the settlement. Thank you all.
Thanks, Varun. And next we'll go to Tariq Rahman.
Hey everyone, I am a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. And in the special issue, my paper focused on the relationship between fraud and property rights. So I did field work in Lahore with patwaris, who are these lower level bureaucrats. And because of the way that the land revenue system is set up in Lahore, patwaris trace genealogical lines of descent in order to verify the ownership of land before it can be sold. And because of a recent real estate boom in Pakistan over the past couple of decades, there's been a sort of rush to try to claim property rights. And so I looked at different cases of fraud, basically like trying to modify records, either by changing inscriptions in record books or bringing new documents into the conversation, like death certificates or marriage certificates or new things, birth certificates, all kinds of certificates, to try to change the way that property was constructed in the records. And I think what I ultimately landed on in all of this was how, I guess, number one, fraud is something that is practiced by both the state and citizens. So it's kind of a way to like level out some of what's happening in the property market, not to think of it as just like corrupt bureaucrats or unethical citizens, but kind of fraud as a way to look at. And then another thing that I landed on was how property can be very unstable in South Asia. Often we think about property as sort of like the holy grail of the post-colony. If you get property, you've made it. But I think by looking at these cases of fraud, what came up for me was how, I mean, really, at least in this context, property is never secure. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Tariq. Next, I'll call on Shima Fatima.
Hello, thank you, IIHS, for giving us this platform. I think it's almost 2 years since I had flown down for the conference. And I'm in Patna, luckily, so it is a good time to also talk about it. Well, this is a part of my PhD work, and I was teaching in the architecture college in Bombay. So I had the trope of continuously looking for a master plan in Patna, and that's how I wasted almost 2 years looking for a master plan. I didn't find anything, so I wanted to write about the city not being planned and what is formal and informal and legal, etc. And one fine day, I remember midnight, I thought, why I'm not looking at the housing board? And on the website, I found the minute of the meeting. It was the peak of RTI activism, and they had uploaded for almost 60 years the minutes of the meeting. And thankfully, I downloaded all of them that very night. I didn't wait that I'll go back to it, because I think within a few months, they had removed it. And I'm assuming it must be a mistake on the lower staff to have uploaded it. But then on the margins of those files and the notings of those files actually made me completely rethink that how should we look, one should look at these non-metropolitan cities when you want to talk about the urban, and the tropes have to be completely changed. And well, I wrote my PhD, I finished it, but I think this drafting category really helped me rethink and rework and reframe a lot of my arguments, because the state was actually in licensing with the bureaucracy, continuously drafting by creating not only new categories but also legislation, on which I emphasize a lot, which is also called the Ordinance Raj in Bihar, where almost 700 to 800 ordinances were promulgated and reformulated continuously for a period of 10 to 15 years. And these was largely in the arena of land. It is also the time of 1970s, where the Urban Land Ceiling Act is being continuously spoken about as a counter conversation to the rural, what was happening in rural at that point of time. So I also look at the state politics to reflect on what was happening spatially, a category which one doesn't really think about, that, as if. So the state spatial expansion is a negotiation which was happening through the state politics also, which was very caste driven at the same time. So I take the Bihar State Housing Board as my empirical evidence to write about drafting and redrafting from the margins, and how a lot of categories was created, which I'll speak about later, where an elaborate category was created. And this categorization was not available to everyone in the same way. So, I also talk about the Parviwalas who had access to information in the Sachivalaya or the legislative offices. So rest when we talk.
Thank you, Shima. Up next, Sangeeta Banerjee.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sangeeta, and really nice to see everyone again and talk about city drafting. I am a human geographer who's also an urban geographer, and I'm currently working at New York University in Shanghai. And for my doctoral research, I have ethnographically engaged with brokerage practices within the development planning department of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, which is also responsible for its master planning activities. And this is a department that operates across scales. And I kind of, spent a lot of time moving between these scales and trying to understand how different brokers and fixers essentially interact with the different officers and practices at these different scales. I'm currently also starting to work on questions of memory and belonging within an urban village in Guangzhou, which is a megacity in southern China, and potentially thinking of a comparison between India and China to think through the processes or peculiarities of Asian urbanization. So the paper that I'm currently I'm looking forward to discussing with you all is called Fixing Bhimnagar. And in this paper, I narrate the incidents surrounding a devastating slum demolition that took place in the M East ward of Mumbai during my doctoral fieldwork. And testament to the contingent and contradictory processes that city drafting describes, I I present these kinds of contradictory practices through an analysis of the practices of two key fixers or brokers that manipulated the outcome of the demolition process, and also the rehab and resettlement process emerging from the demolition of Bhimnagar. And in this paper, I show how these two completely ideologically disparate fixers and brokers, manipulated the material outcomes of the slum demolition process and improvised extensively to provisionally unsettle and settle urban space in the context of Bhimnagar. So it basically, city drafting essentially completely helped me frame the events of a very, very confusing demolition process that happened in Bhimnagar. And I show at the end of this paper, I show how, on the one hand, these fixers were able to delay the displacement of the residents, and on the other hand, they created hierarchies in the distribution of resettlement benefits based on religion and caste. And while these different kinds of actors in the past have been seen as sources of corruption, city drafting has allowed me to show them as a resource that can be mobilized to remain fixed in the city and to remain settled in the city. And focusing on the quotidian practices or everyday practices of these ambiguous fixers operating within the demolished informal settlement brings forth a complicated and contradictory politics that ensures the existence of a variety of diverse, non-privatized land tenures in the city, and complicates not just the role of bureaucratic processes, but also the notion of community within what Ananya Roy has called the metonymic slum. So I look forward to discussing what you all think about this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And finally, I'll call on Asher Gertner, who wrote the epilogue for our special feature.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Nice to see the panelists and a virtual wave and shout out to the invisible attendees who I can't see, but I see a list of names. That would have been lovely to have engaged you in person. But thanks for joining us. So yeah, I have a different role here because I attended the workshop that led to where first drafts of the drafting papers were presented. I guess it was 2 years ago. And then I kind of forgot about all of you because I was busy and doing things. And then Tom and Indivar graciously invited me, or put the burden on me, whichever way you want to look at it, of writing an epilogue, thinking through the papers collectively, but it was fun because I got to return to it and see revisions, redraftings of those older papers. And so my epilogue was really just a kind of attempt to find some through threads that I thought tied the papers together in ways that I think didn't really in any way pay fidelity to the work of the papers, in the sense that I think I just went on my own a little bit. So apologies to the authors for applying my own reading to your respective empirical findings, but I guess that's the kind of privilege of the epiloguist, if you will. So what's really stood out to me in the papers and reading them was, I mean, I guess we had thought in the context of the conference where these draft papers were first shared about drafting at, I know the word provisionality has come up. So drafting as the kind of ongoing editorial amendment of a written work, right? So adding words, subtracting words, sometimes in such a way that there's not always a trace of what has been amended, but often there is. And then the other more technical sense of drafting, just like literally, is drawing lines or marks or adding symbols or symbology to a page, written or digital. But when I was reading back over the papers, I guess it was in January of this year, I was reminded of the historian Bhavani Raman's really fabulous analysis in her book, Document Raj, which was on the early 19th century East India Company and the rise of these technical scribes in the context of new systems of land and revenue administration. And so this concept of like document Raj somehow came back to me when reading all of your papers. And what Raman really compellingly argues, I think, is that it was in this context of the kind of calculative reach of the colonial state that a new logic of property entered into the everyday life of landowners and users, specifically through documents, right? And she says what was unique about this was that it was specifically documented possession that began to define what property was. It wasn't associational relations, it wasn't word of mouth, local knowledge systems. It was specifically this written document. And so this led to, right, the rise of these specialist scribes with their unique technical knowledges of scripts and local languages that allowed colonial administrators to consolidate systems of land and revenue records for, more abstracted systems of governance. And what Bhavani argues in that book, as I remember, was that there's the specific dispositions towards writing, or what she, I think in a few places in the book, calls like a writing habitus, that came to shape in really durable ways the way that the state's own expert knowledge operated, as well as how it was that citizens could approach and seek redress from the state. So what was really striking to me in the set of papers that you all wrote was how those old scribes of the East India Company, from 200 years ago, I found sort of like modern day versions of them scattered around all of your papers. In the patwaris of Lahore that Tarek's paper talks about, or in Gurgaon that Shupra's paper was talking about, or in the Building and Factory Department of Mumbai, or in the Patna Housing Board, or in the Sub-Registrar's Office. So what that led me to think of was like really how we might think of this set of papers and the practice of city drafting really around kind of ethnographic objects, because all of the papers here were fairly contemporary. I mean, they were historical, but they involved sort of active fieldwork within the bureaucracy in certain ways. And so I thought of it in terms of these three ethnographic objects: scripts, or the historically specific inscriptive rules for how property is written, like actually how words are recorded, whether with hand or in what script. And then in terms of scribes, or the specific bureaucrats and the associated experts whose graphical and grammatological knowledges shape how property is made and also unmade. And then finally, the scribbles and the notations and the jottings and the markings that drew land and documents together in all kinds of complicated ways. So that's what I tried to do in it. And that led me to sort of think of that, you know, when you're writing about other people's work, you have a kind of freedom to speculate. So I had some speculations around maybe what we're thinking about here is a kind of grammatology of the state, or maybe what we're thinking about here is like enduring vernacular forms of property that continue to shape the way that caste, religion, language, region become scarred and divided today. But it was a super fun set of papers to think with. So thanks for sharing them. And I hope those of you in the audience who haven't checked them out yet will have a chance to do so.
Thank you, Asher. Thanks, everyone. We've come a long way from the drafts 2 years ago to these 3-minute theses, which were all brilliantly articulated. Thanks to the audience for being here. We have like 80 plus people in the room. And just to give you an overview of what's going to happen now, for the next 30 to 40 minutes, I and Tom are going to moderate a discussion between the panelists, posing some questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature to drop in your questions and we'll get to them. We'll definitely save 20 minutes at the end to field audience questions. All right, so let me just pick up where Asher left off. So I'm going to pose questions to specific people, you know, based on my idiosyncratic wish of hearing you speak about certain topics, but keep in mind if you want to add something about a specific topic later on. So yeah, picking up from where Asher left off, you know, Tom and I were thinking a lot about this question of the old and the new, these old inscriptive practices that in the colonial period emerged as new and continue to today. In all of our work, we think about the legacies of these colonial practices, these inscriptive technologies. But I think what city drafting, what these papers have shown is also all of the ways in which they're constantly renewed and remade. Right. So I would love to hear Tariq and Shima speak to this to begin with. So Tariq, you know, in your work, you talk a lot about the sort of the historical characteristics of the property regime shaping the practices in the contemporary moment, given this sort of property boom that emerges. And inscription is really important in your work, so I'd love for you to speak to that. And Shima, your paper is explicitly historical, and you talk about notings and, you know, things that are not written and cannot be found, but then also these surprising things that are inscribed. So maybe think a little bit about the historical and in the present. So let's begin with Tariq.
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question. So I think like building on what Asher was talking about, like patwaris are really interesting figures because patwaris predated colonial administrators. But prior to colonialism, from what I understand, I mean, they were sort of like very low in the hierarchy, kind of not well respected authorities in administering land records for the Mughals. And then they became elevated under colonialism, so they acquired a lot of sort of power. They became the source of authority for determining land rights. There's these stories in Lahore about patwaris like riding around on horses and having a lot of respect, and patwaris like really miss the old days and things like that. And then now you have the government of Punjab introducing a digital system. And this is arising out of a critique of patwaris having too much power and being associated with colonialism in the post-colonial state, and the need for Pakistan to develop like a modern land revenue system. And so I kind of just like briefly chart the history to say that colonialism is like a watershed moment in the land revenue system, but it's not the only one. And I think like my paper is a little bit guilty of sort of like centering things on that moment, but the history existed prior to that, and it's continuing to unfold after that in really interesting ways. And I think it's like really important to attend to the colonial legacy, but to also think about like the new vectors of power that are entering the picture, which I would say right now I mean, really, for the most part, didn't exist at that time. It's stuff like financialization, digitization, global development, and so on, right? And so, but there's a colonial legacy there that's very defining and important. But yeah, it's like I don't want to get, I don't know where to take this, but like I think it's really important to not get like too stuck on that and to say colonialism happened and therefore XYZ. I think it's really important to kind of like situate that within a longer history. But I don't have anything to add to that, so I'd be interested in others' thoughts if it comes up.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about the frictions between these ongoing processes of financialization and digitization and these older inscriptive technologies. Shima, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, currently in Bihar and Jharkhand, I'm doing this field work, and this patwari showed me a whole room in a small town in Palamu district, which is a lot of this colonial paper, which nobody even knows that it can be referred while they're trying to find lineages and family properties because of digitization. So today, block offices and other places, if you go because of digitization, it's just not the place for paper material, but it also is place of family negotiations and stories and family trees, etc., etc. Thinking from that, when I came back, I was also thinking that, today when we are writing about the city of Patna, we are only writing, there's only about eviction and, as if these slum dwellers or marginal neighborhoods have had no say in the city or have had no presence in the city or had no identity in the city. But only when you go to the housing board file and you say that it is only on the margin that it has been written that, okay, you can change the land given for slum improvement program for a housing cooperative. So then how does that margin, notations on the margin gets translated into a digital format? Because now the digital format is continuously trying to erase this naughtiness and complications. And it only wants to identify you in terms of a point or a line or a dot, that is how GIS configures itself. But there's so much of story into it. And it's only when I was looking at the housing board that I could have a new perspective to even look at the story about the slum, how, like the Patna Municipal Corporation has never had even a proper list of the number of slums in the city. I'm like talking about a non-metropolitan city where these kind of notified or non-notified listing also does not exist. So then such drafting practices, it's like taking a step backward to map that family tree. Here, the family tree is like a lot of people, in that property, which was social housing for the state. The state as a part of the social housing was supposed to provide for all these different income groups. So if I look at that now, how it has been turned into a private property where we have judges colony and IS colony and, a professors colony in a small town like this, then what happens to all those people who were never allotted housing just because, they didn't know about it or they didn't have access to that kind of, written on a piece of paper, he should be given because he has been doing well in the office. So I think that taking step backward and then reflecting on the present is what this really does to us, to the contemporary conversation, that taking a step backward is really important.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And I thought of you both because of how important genealogy and lineage making is. And thanks for highlighting the trends between the historical and the contemporary. But this question of lineage making or establishing linkages or the ensuring continuities in governance and recording and so on really raises a sort of central question in city drafting about provisionality and uncertainty. I think that was a big starting point for both Tom and I to think about how is the city shaped by these uncertain relations. We have this how do we think about city making in relation to property making? And so maybe the next couple of questions I want to ask are around this idea of provisionality. How do how do people make claims and stake ground based on negotiating with this uncertainty? And I'd love to hear from Sangeeta and Varun, right? Sangeeta, in your paper, you talk about spatial fixing, and that can mean very different things. And I'd love for you to elucidate what you mean by spatial fixing. How does uncertainty become spatial fixing? And then Varun, in your paper, you talk about the politics of regularization and, some of the you kind of read it in a different way, contrary to sort of the middle class or elite picture of, regularization as corruption. And, you talk about how people are able to consolidate from uncertainty. So yeah, I'd love to hear from both of you. Sangeeta, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's particularly, important in the case that, in the case of Bhimnagar, because the opening scene in the paper that I write is about a demolition that kind of started, when I was sitting in the bureaucratic offices of the building and factory department of the BMC, and ended up lasting for 3 days, and and ended with the demolition of around 400 homes. And while this process was super, it was a very kind of visceral, very traumatizing process for everyone involved. I kind of noticed one of the things that was happening during this process, and which was that people were, running around trying to gather documents during the demolition. And nobody actually kind of understood why this demolition was happening, or when it would stop, or how, who was actually doing the demolition. In the moment, nobody actually understood what was actually going on. And there was so much provisionality and so much uncertainty involved in this process. But the one thing that everybody knew and understood was that they must have their documents in place. And that kind of, was something that struck me as interesting, something that needed to be, given some attention at that point. And the other thing that I found very interesting was that it was a variety of people who, one of my informants in the settlement had kind of told me was a dalal, right? Like a variety of dalals, different kinds of dalals were dalals, or brokers, middlemen, fixers, etc. They were the ones who were essentially kind of urging the people to gather their documents, to make sure that they had all the paperwork in place in case they needed to present it to the bureaucrats, right? So and later on, I kind of realized that none of this paperwork, none of the documents that were being gathered by the people would have stood a chance in court, right? Because all of them had been created by these fixers and brokers, and they kind of they could be understood to be quote unquote forged, right? But in that moment, even presenting that paper to a bureaucrat would have kind of given pause, made the bureaucrat think a little bit for a certain, for a certain period of time. And that itself would have kind of allowed the people to stay put for a little bit of time, right? And that, and once that demolition essentially stops, then it kind of takes a long time for it to get started again. Right. And so in this kind of provisional, uncertain terms, by these very, contradictory practices, people through the brokers and these kinds of different kinds of inscripted devices were able to stay put and spatially remain fixed in the city. And that's the kind of stuff that city drafting actually allows us to think about and formulate. So yeah, I mean, it's a long-winded answer to kind of thinking about how city drafting can allow us to, think about uncertainty and improvisation.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think, as we're going through the papers, we'll also hear different scales at which this is happening and different sort of interest groups or class and caste sort of projects, right? So here we're talking about staying put, which is very different than consolidating or committing fraud or amassing large amounts of land. Let's hear from
Sorry,
sure,
can I make
quick.
one more?
Yeah.
And the interesting part of it is that even after after the demolition ended, it's been like 4 years since the demolition, and the settlement is like intact. It's remained in place, and has now gotten piped water supply and a concrete road by it. So it just goes to say the power of these like provisional documents as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Varun, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I'll just introduce a bit of the field so that people get an idea of what I'm talking when I mean provisionality. So basically, the spatial form or the neighborhood I was exploring was these unauthorized colonies on Bangalore Development Authority land, and one particular layout which I call Lakshmi layout, and it's survived for 40 years since the BDA land acquisition, which came in 1979. And it's consolidated its property through a lot of these provisional practices, which go across the scales, taking from panchayat, agrarian land khata instead of getting an urban site khata. And so various kinds of practices. And one of the practices which I think most Bangaloreans know and which is always a fascination, even in everyday talk, is this practice of B Khata, where khata means tax paper, but the municipality has invented a provisional practice where to recognize unauthorized colonies and give them infrastructure, they give you a alternative tax paper called B Khata. And it's not exactly B Khata, it's called B Register in the municipality, but due to all these city drafting practices, it has acquired the name of B Khata, suggesting that it's very much like an official thing. And so this provisionality in terms of, yes, in the 40 years, the settlement has seen ups and downs because laws have changed, everything. But the provisionality, I would say, is definitely more in the law process. But property, as we understand it, is not just a legal thing. It's also what are the relationalities, the political networks underlying it. So as you talk to the residents, they all are anxious about the provisionality. They say our diabetes and our heart attacks would be less if we are regularized, definitely. But they also would kind of say that, hey, look, our settlement, so much infrastructure is there. The buses come, so many this one. But so in that sense that there is a tension, the provisionality in the law is there, but there's also stability underneath it, which they know is due to the relationality underpinning property forms. So there is this tension, which I would say is something which city drafting is helping to think about. What do we exactly mean by this provisionality? Yeah. Thank you.
Indra, can I jump in? I just wondered, I think some of the way, at least I'm thinking about provisionality is a kind of antidote to some of the kind of radical incompatibility between the way that we govern and the way that we try to regulate space and the way that we live in space. And so, and that incompatibility is expressed then in very different ways. So in Tariq's case, you speak about property as kind of fundamentally a practice of fraud, right? Which requires, the suspension of sort of normative codes and a kind of belief in something else, right? And that something else is itself provisional. Like fraud, in a way, is a kind of speculation, is a kind of belief in a different kind of register that will claim your property. And provisionality also requires these rather elastic, as Asha talked about, kind of grammatological practices, right? These ways to administer space that can always be re-amended and editorialized and extended in new ways. We require this kind of second set of materials and ideologies and practices that can make up for the incompatibility of our kind of governing systems. I think the bureaucracy plays a really important role in that, in kind of rendering the incompatible settled, at least provisional, fixed in Sangeeta's case.
Can I jump in too, Indevar? I want to pick up on what three of the people have said about provisionality and contingent nature of it. And as Varun was saying, that when I think of contingent urbanization, it's not a random act. It's not arbitrary. It has a certain kind of logic. And in fact, it is very much tied in places. And I sort of think that when I think of Delhi or Bangalore or Mumbai as which have a sort of a geography of a city versus a place like Gurgaon, which until very recently was rural, agrarian, and was the district headquarter. There is a different kind of contingency and which is tied to, and provisionality, which is tied to a particular kind of anticipation, a particular kind of speculation, which is rooted in a sort of relations of property, which are agrarian, I think, which brings out the contestations are different. Because in a place like Gurgaon, where you have villages, the entire city until recently is all villages, which are completely caste-based, right? So you actually have geographies which is saying, this is Jat, this is Gujar, this is Yadav, and that's the city is actually organized. In such a place, the way in which this provisional dimensions of city drafting works is quite fascinating and is kind of takes you back in time. And I think that's the part which is very crucial to think about. How does a city emerge in a place? This is not, it was not a city. So a city emerge in sort of a agrarian hinterland. And what are those dynamics of provisionality and contingency, which are similar or different to a setting which has been urban for, let's say, in case of Delhi, for, I don't know, hundreds of years. So when I think about provisionality, I think it becomes important to think about it as having a certain vernacular logic, which is tied to certain rhythms, certain ecologies, and certain practices, caste-based practices, which becomes place-based practices become essential. And it is in the interim, it's in between between these master plans, in case of Gurgaon, which has had 3 in a very short period, is when you begin to see these logics are playing out. So they are very much choreographed and carefully managed, which only the planners and the bureaucrats know about. So just wanted to say that it is not random or arbitrary. And I think that's the point which, Varun, you were making. There is a logic to these irregularities and regularities. So just going to stop there.
Thank you. You actually preempted the question I was going to ask you to kind of talk about, these logics of flexible planning. So I wondered if I could ask Tariq also to speak to this question of provisionality and uncertainty. Like you have this really evocative ethnography of fraud, and the uncertainty question is really central to your work. And if I may, could you also, since your case study is in Lahore, I was wondering if there's something you want to highlight about the Pakistani context or the Lahore context, and if there's something distinctive about what's happening there. That's just an optional question, but we'd love to hear from you on that. And then I'll hand it over to Tom after that to ask a next set of questions on caste and so on.
Yeah, sure. I guess that I'm not really sure like where this is going to go, but one interesting thing about Pakistan is that property rights are like on the one hand legislated by like the Transfer of Property Act from the 1880s, but on the other hand, sort of expected to abide by Islamic laws of inheritance. And so you have this sort of like the bureaucratic system set up to administer, what's ultimately like a very ethical system of inheritance. And I don't know, like the question of provisionality becomes really interesting in that situation, because I feel like maybe that's like sort of like the tension that's happening in Pakistan is like on the one hand this desire by I think both citizens and the state to kind of run things according to Islamic law, but on the other hand this huge bureaucratic apparatus set up by the British, which is ultimately like very secular in nature. And I think that in my case, that's where a lot of the provisionality comes from, is sort of like finding ways to negotiate that tension. And so I'm not sure like where that is situated in terms of like logics or randomness. I guess if I were to just put it in my own language, I would say that it's, I think for most people, a way of coping with living in the city. That I'm not sure that either one of these systems by itself like sort of works for anyone. And both of them coming together create this sort of tension. And so evoking, either a moral doctrine or a legal doctrine at any given moment is I think just how a lot of people like come to meet their needs. Sort of an unformed thought, but I'll leave it at that.
Right, I think I'm going to take over. We wanted to touch a lot of the papers in the collection speak to a differing level of depth to questions of caste and how caste relations shape processes of property making, both in that sense, but also how drafting practices shape caste geographies. And we know, for example, Sheena's paper actually speaks quite clearly to this, that the project of administration and of the state has long been a project of social sorting and social administration, relaying caste into new kinds of political formation. So we were interested in asking you guys how caste figures in your work and whether viewing caste from a drafting perspective changes how we consider caste relations in the city. Shubhra, your paper takes caste quite centrally, but also deals with emerging forms of political formation around caste. So I was interested in how you considered the role of caste in drafting practices.
Shima, do you want to go first? And then...
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So also to continue from the conversation we had about provisionality, to think of it, the establishment of Bihar State Housing Board itself was a provisional act, like it was a temporary negotiation between the switching over from the improvement trust to the housing board and not forming the development authority, the Patna Development Authority. And I think that gave the bureaucracy a lot of window to never have a rule of administration for the housing board for almost first 1 decade, and to work through ordinances. And what these ordinances were also operating at a point of time when there was a lot of conversation in the Legislative Assembly about the Urban Land Ceiling Act, where everybody was imagining that it would lead to socialization of land in the urban context also. And largely in terms of Bihar, we always talk about caste in reference to the rural. We never imagine it to have any sort of interference or implication in the urban context. Now nobody really looks at it at all. We always were so entrapped in looking in terms of housing stories or improvement trust stories, or how land was allocated, or what was the processes and the procedures. It's only when we start looking in the fine line, for example, when I started looking at the listing of cooperative housing societies, which was done with the housing board, then you realize that the caste was so much in the center of this listing. It's only in the end of listing where you see that there's a listing for a Ambedkar colony, or there's a listing for the Safai Karamchari. But at the top of the list, you see a listing for housing colony for the professors, the judges colony. You have the Sachivalaya, the RBI, the SBI, it is all there. But and a lot of these housing cooperatives were actually listed or registered with the housing board much later in 75. But there were many other housing cooperatives which was listed, say the Ambedkar colony or the Karamchari associations, etc., which was registered as early as 65, but they were never allotted land. And the simple logic in the notings of these files says that, well, they don't know, they don't read the newspaper, they don't have access, and they cannot read. So they don't know that there's an application for a housing cooperative or a housing allocation. Which is reducing the whole conversation to a very low denominator, to say that only because they're not able to read. But even like what I say, the access to the Parviwala or the Sachivayawalas, like, who is in the Sachivalaya or the secretariat, and what kind of negotiation can happen between the precarious state politics and the bureaucrat, who, when both of them may be coming from the same village. So that negotiation that somebody is, like in cities like Patna, people still come from that, I'm from that village and I can go to that person's house because I'm just from that village. So that kind of access to information is absolutely caste driven, that, where can I go looking for that piece of paper where I can ask Karpuri Thakur or Jay Prakash to write that, I'm a good person and I should be given a house. Just because, he's a respected person in the city, and that's why he should be allowed a housing board flat.
Should I go? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Shima. I think something which you said in the beginning really resonates, and I think it's very important to take into account in my context, because the question of caste in places like, in the settings of urban planners or town planners' offices doesn't surface easily, right? There is no mention of caste. You have to kind of gauge that. You're trying to figure out, are you a Jat? Are you, or as Sangeeta mentions, they ask who you are. So it's a very hidden question. It's a very buried in this question. And you say, okay, Yadav, obviously, you know who they are. So for instance, in my case, in the plans, firstly, absence of plans or the draft plans you have, the caste is not there in the drafts, yet it is functioning. And it is this hidden transcript which we have of caste, which emerges in a particular way, which forces you to go back. So in fact, as Tom has shown in his work, and I've been looking at that, it is the colonial gazetteers that we start seeing the questions of a very detailed ethnographic accounts of how caste is actually sedimented in the ecology and the geography of the land, that you begin to ask, why did Gurgaon develop the way it developed? What does this unevenness speak to? Why did certain developers get leverage over others? And in this particular moment, what is the questions of so-called, which Tom and Nitin Bartla and others have talked about, is a question of the commons, the so-called wasteland, and how does the question of caste intersect with the question of class? And here I mean how the smallholders or the landless, in particular the your Dalits and pastoralist groups like Mayos and others, are left out of urban plans completely. And in fact, it is their mutually agreed relationships, not titles to property and land, which are now at that juncture where you have Babas and Gurus coming into the picture. So it is precisely the kind of absence of the caste narrative, or it is as you're saying, Shima, in your case, it is very rural, right? It's a caste function in rural. So the interesting question is, how does it manifest itself in this moment of agrarian urban transformation? What are the ways? It is not like in a housing board. There is no housing. I mean, there is housing, but there's not a housing board where you can actually demarcate, okay, this is a colony for this and a colony for this. There is low income housing and EWAs in Gurgaon too. But in the context of gated communities, it works. But also, more importantly, in the context, the ways in which land is being assetized in the commons at the moment, in the areas which are the Aravallis, which is kind of under contestation if it is actually a forest or a Gair Mumkin Pahad, uncultivable land. Who has stakes in this? Whose property is that? What are the mutual agreements of access and use? And what are the caste class nexus, which play out in very subtle ways? So in fact, when you go to places like this, it's very much hidden ways in which you find. So the current phase of development, which I want to, we've been working on, is how the Gujars, who are pastoralist groups who have some titles to land, but relatively weaker ones, are the ones where Gurgaon's development is taking place. And that's the question which one can ask, the current tensions which are playing out in the context of Hindu majoritarianism is also in and through those caste alliances. So caste is not so visible, yet very palpable in the everyday urban contexts, which makes it difficult and almost difficult to track, but also necessary to go back in time to see how the urban spatial formation takes place, which actors come into play, how does this manipulation take place, and how it is manifested in the context of urban space and place and politics of land accumulation and grabbing. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shubha. Yeah, I think that kind of ties into our next set of questions, which are really around real estate. Real estate's kind of in the room in all of our papers, and something that we were talking about at the workshop, and this kind of been developed through the papers, is the extent to what drafting does to real estate projects and that kind of processes of assetization. Is drafting purely mediative, or does it pose challenges? Does it augment that project of land capture and land grabs that kind of take the kind of headlines within urban theory? But perhaps drafting kind of complicates that narrative. I think perhaps Sangeeta and Asha, perhaps you could also speak to this. Sangeeta, you make this claim, I think it's already been mentioned, that drafting in your case does some of the work to carry through a spatial fix, which is quite, quite a claim. So to what extent does drafting purely facilitate that fix, or is there something a bit more complicated going on?
I mean, it's the drafters rather than the drafting that actually kind of facilitates I would say facilitates or kind of impedes the spatial fix, right? So, I mean, to that extent, I would kind of say that, okay, let's go back to Bhimnagar, right? So in the case of Bhimnagar, if we were to think about, what happens to the question of real estate over here in the paper. So, I mean, real estate would have kind of shown up in the rehab and resettlement allocation in the case of if the demolition were to take place, right? So if the demolition kind of proceeds and the survey is completed, and if the allocation kind of happens, then the 15-story building in the allotted spot kind of gets built. And then like some of the fixers in the settlement are likely to gain more, right? Like because they have kind of appropriated many of the resettlement units, many of the, quote unquote, allotted resettlement units in the Basti. But as the conflict is essentially emerges in the settlement, none of this actually comes to kind of fruition. None of the rehab units get built. None of the actual relocation of the residents actually take place. So then perhaps because there is no kind of there is no settlement between the two different kinds of fixers that are operating within Bhimnagar, real estate is unable to kind of, fix itself in this particular story, right? But if there was kind of a consent between these two different kinds of fixers, and the different, the political realm was clear, then definitely the survey process would have been completed, and the demolition would have been completed, and the real estate project would have happened. So I think in that sense, I think the fixers and the quote unquote drafters become fundamental to the process of real estate accumulation, real estate surplus accumulation. But I mean, I don't know where their loyalties essentially kind of lie at this point, right? And when we were to think, if we were to also think about the question of caste in this question, in this scenario, like it does not show up in the master plans. It does not show up in the development plans or the technical, documents of the housing authorities, etc. But it's always ever present in the 227 electoral ward maps of Mumbai, right, which has to be overlaid on each and every master plan in Mumbai. So if you were to think about it in those terms as well, like caste is always like one of the kind of defining features of how master planning process actually kind of is completed. So in this case also, I would say even real estate is fundamentally tied to the play of politics and caste politics, to be particular in this case. Sorry.
I can say something really quick, Tom, but I was just keeping an eye on the time and the Q&A questions. But I guess there's kind of two ways I would really quickly try to think of this in the context of the papers and my epilogue that doesn't really have anything empirical, but it was just to think of like, so if we go back to that question of the expansion of the colonial bureaucracy and systems of writing, it's to note that the sort of solution to the problem of expanding networks of trade and revenue circulation wasn't to replace existing vernacular systems, but to rather operate through them in a kind of translational manner. So when I'm trying to think of like a grammatology of the state here, it's to sort of recognize the ways that the colonial bureaucracy, and perhaps the way that capital moves into new sort of vernacular land regimes today, is one that necessarily relies on particular kinds of what Shubhra in her paper calls these figures of property making, or what Raman's book Document Raj talks about as these scribes. So scribes become key. So I think it has a necessarily kind of mediative role, drafting does, but also necessarily a constitutive one at the same time. So I'm thinking like I've been in Goa now for 10 months doing a project around land investment and real estate here. And what's really striking, what becomes really evident here is how in the context of a lot of talk around digitalization of land records, an attempt to sort of render flat and even and syntactically and grammatologically very simple property transactions, right? To try to reduce everything to a single centralized hub where you can see from afar and know what property looks like and know how you can get it and do the computational work to kind of get it, right? That in fact, that system is not really working. It's really fallen flat. And instead what's emerged is this reliance on, again, these really key figures. So it just reminds me of the point that sort of capital doesn't land in places, it settles, and it becomes implicated in bureaucratic chains. It gets implicated in necessarily linguistic and vernacular chains, and it has to write its way into existing systems of land administration and governance. So that's, I guess, just a call to think of, like, if we're reflecting on planetary urbanization processes, then it's the way that the agents of that are as much here as they are there. They're as much working through these vernacular caste, deeply embedded networks as they are impacted somehow by them.
That's perfect. I think due to time, we're going to have to move to the Q&A, and some of the questions have already been touched upon in our general discussion. I will, for time's sake, try to pick out the questions in the questions, and maybe try and group the questions together if we're nearing the end. Okay, so first question from Andrew D refers to urbanization outside of the metropolitan core. He writes that so much of urbanization in India is happening in smaller towns and in peripheries. How does drafting or provisionality play a role in this more recent wave of kind of small town urbanization? Is it Subay Babawal has asked what where's the question? Oh yeah, how do we distinguish, and this might be related, how do we distinguish drafting from urban planning? To what extent is urban planning a part of the drafting paraphernalia, or are we thinking about drafting in opposition to kind of classical urban spatial planning? So maybe we should start with these two questions, and then I can get my head around the other two questions, which are quite long. Varun, maybe you're a good person to speak to this relationship between planning and drafting, if you're able to. And Shubhra, obviously you're the peripheral expert here, and can probably speak to this. Is this massive small town urbanization a consequence of drafting, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I mean, that's a question which even the last section of my paper I wanted to kind of address, that is city drafting representing a failure of planning, or is planning also can be seen as a form of city drafting, right? I mean, because ethnographies of a lot of planning have deconstructed that process and shown what it is. In the case of the spatial form I study, where the planning was done, the Bangalore Development Authority planned for the general public, but this general public we know meant largely upper income groups and upper caste groups. So in that kind of a sense, city drafting was used in many places to kind of redistribute land back. So I wouldn't see city drafting practices as a failure of planning, but rather in a sense taking planning in the direction of more of a redistributive mode, particularly, I mean, drawing from my research experiences of land regularization. Yeah, if that's the way I have understood that question. Thank you.
Very briefly, I know the other very interesting questions there. So very briefly, I think the question of the way I see both Tom and Endeavor urging us to think through the framework of city drafting is precisely to kind of problematize and mess up the idea of a plan, right? The idea of a plan as the state act is something which just, even the planners admit, they make plans, but we know how planning takes place. It's precisely to draw attention to the messiness of planning and how it lands in places in South Asia with its particular colonial history. But also what I think city drafting is urging us to move away from the idea of the plan to thinking about, through Nikhil Menon's work, around cities in motion as a constantly negotiated, incomplete process, which is contested and very, very contextual. So I think it's not that they're this or that, but in fact, they work together, and to draw attention to other drafters right? To think about other drafters, other actors who may get left out of the otherwise in the cast of characters of the urban plans and planning. So I think of them working together rather than in separate ways. I'll leave the question for periphery for now because I know there are more questions, but so I'll stop here.
Can we have a question which Asha touched upon, but perhaps others want to, Tarek, also you very briefly touched on about whether the digital turn and the introduction of new digital systems of land administration and cadastral administration are complicating all of the kind of stuff we're referring to as city drafting, whether it introduces a different kind of register to govern property and how successful that might have been. So he'll ask, how do you see the framework of city drafting evolving with the ongoing digitalization of property making in South Asia, especially in terms of the changing forms of these traces, these kind of historical inscriptive traces that Asha introduced. So Asha's already kind of refuted the impact of digitalization. Is anyone ready to stand up for Digital India?
Yeah,
Asia,
so
sorry.
let me draw from my own this thing. So last week when I was there was this woman and she said everybody had been telling her in this block office that the server is down. And she kept coming and saying, server ko bula do, please call the server. Because she imagined the server to be a person. And that is how the state is ensuring that it still manages to draft because the server can be down. And in states like Jharkhand and Bihar, the server is down at definite periods of time for definite reasons. So it also ensures these breakages in the digital process that you have to go to that babu. You have to go to get it checked or stamped. You even have to go to the officer to once, even if you finish the whole process, for him to use his pen drive to and plug it in the laptop and update your this thing, you have to go to that officer. And then he ensures that what is he going to note on your file, where he can very easily reject it or accept it or say that this is incomplete, or in some cases, even if it is incomplete, say, oh, well, it is incomplete, but we can go and ask him to write an affidavit or do things like that. So I think the bureaucracy ensures ways that it is still writing, not on the margins now in the same way as it was doing on the file and notations, because those files are, those files would also have various iterations. So the same minutes of the meeting had various iterations where something could be scrapped off or, canceled, and then something else is written by somebody, or the politician overwrites it, or the meeting is not held because the person says, I'm not going to come. Those kind of negotiation. That same thing is being maintained in the digital age through the server, through the internet, through the electricity not being there or being there at a certain point of time.
I can just add a little bit onto this. It's a really great question. So I put a comment in the chat, but I think only the host and panelists can see it. But it's just about how I think in Lahore, at least, provisionality, I think more than anything else probably facilitates the needs of capital, and that has to do with the need for capitalism to be flexible and constantly moving. I think like Asher's first book is a great example of this, right? The sort of like contingency of laws that ultimately boil down to the needs of capital. And I think that's very much an argument that I make in my article too, that this provisionality is sort of like how the provisionality of property rights is how people kind of come to take advantage of rising land values in Lahore. And the interesting thing about digitization in Lahore is that it's very much an attempt to sort of constrict provisionality. I mean, a digital database is essentially set up as a grid where everything needs to be in its rightful place and is incredibly rigid and inflexible. I mean, that's like the sort of goal of a digital database, to eliminate all of these contingencies. And without getting into too much detail, I mean, what's happened in Lahore is that actually, because you have this interesting situation of where, it's provisionality and flexibility that is accommodating capital in the real estate market. The digital system, which was actually like intended to, kind of sort of modernize the real estate market and the land market, and make it like super legible and clean and faster, it's actually like really interfered with a lot of the ways that land is valued and a lot of the mechanisms through which land is financialized in this sort of like more indigenous way that it happens in Lahore. And what's ended up happening is that the system intended to replace patwaris or the scribes and make everything like clean and rationalized and quick has actually ended up with giving patwaris laptops to manage the system, because that's the only way that it can like really function, is if that it's in the hands of patwaris, and this sort of provisionality around like who owns what, and genealogical lines of descent and all that stuff can be maintained. So I don't know. I kind of again like see just a sort of like tension there between kind of this need for like a super modernized, clean, master plan, like rigid system, and the needs of capital, which, and it's not always the way that it's presented. But yeah, I think it's something that's coming out of my case study. So maybe tensions there in like the agenda of the state itself, right? So hard for me to think about the state as like a really coherent, like intentional thing in this case, because I'm seeing like sort of contradictions emerging between these two different needs for things to be modernized and for capital to continue flowing.
Can I make a quick interjection over here? Sorry. I actually wanted to kind of, bring up that I mean, this is not in this paper, but like I've also kind of, during my doctoral fieldwork, I kind of witnessed the transition of BMC into a completely paperless office. So, from a 180-year-old bureaucracy to a paperless bureaucracy. And in that, it was actually the vernacular, the bureaucrats with the vernacular feet of clay, the lower level bureaucrats who were rapidly being kind of, quote unquote, were being, moved out of the bureaucracy, which is like tracers, patwaris, etc. But the databases were actually shifting over to the Esri technicians, right? So the Esri and SAP technicians who actually do not have any kind of relations with the people on, in the neighborhoods that they are mapping. They do not have any social linkages to, the places that they are putting on the database. So it was a bizarre kind of a transition, and but yet something that still involved some human component, and that is just like likely we are yet to see the outcome of these kinds of transitions.
Asha, do you have your hand up? No. Oh, okay. Yeah, I should also, I should, as someone who also works in this digital domain, one thing I think on one hand, you do have the kind of relaying of existing mediation within a digital domain, basically, right? So you have the same kinds of drafting, inscriptive, interpretive practices that took place on the manual system being remediated in a digital, under a digital system. However, I do think the digital brings forward new registers, new authoritative registers of property ownership, new kinds of commitments to propriety, to belief, to faith, which at the end of the day is often the thing that carries a territorial claim. We can all assemble documents, but if you're the one from the particular community, or you're the one with the political connections, then there's often that, or you're the one who can assemble the thing that looks the most normative in a sense, and that often matters. And I think the digital is intervening in that space and introducing new kinds of authoritative registers in that space, as much as it is relaying the old. Yeah. Indiva, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, maybe just in terms of wrapping up, since we're at time, I just wanted to thank the audience for being here again. And there's some great questions in the Q&A that we haven't gotten to about, amnesia in the bureaucracy, about, land holdings getting converted, about, property regimes and unruly processes. There's so much rich material here, and we're really glad that, engaging with this conversation has led to these questions. We thank you for them. There's also a question about, South Asia and representativeness of South Asia. And, I think that's exactly why it's so awesome for us that we're having this conversation at IIHS, where, we're anchoring IIHS is anchoring a lot of conversations on the global South, in the global South, which is super important, and outside and beyond academia as well. So there's so many themes that we've tried to unpack today: colonial logics, provisionality, the real estate turn, caste. We didn't get to a major question that we had about drafting and violence, especially in light of demolition Raj, that, a bulldozer Raj that we've been talking about in India. Like, does provisionality become, an instrument for targeted violence? And this is another set of questions that are very important and interesting. And we think that city drafting adds to that discussion. But let me just wrap up with some thank yous. Thank you firstly to all our panelists here. It's been such a great journey with all of you over these couple of years. A lot of people have supported this work over this time and been in conversation with us. Thanks to all of you, but especially to the editors of City, who gave us this opportunity to develop this into a special feature. Anna Richter and other editors were very closely engaged with editing these papers. Thanks to all the reviewers who contributed to, this thing taking shape. Thanks again to the audience for being here. This made it so worth it, and this was a wonderful conversation through the Q&A. And then finally, once again, thank you to IIHS, Tanvi Bhatikar, Pradnya Pelayur, and Neha Sami, and the whole IIHS team. Thank you so much. And yeah, hoping to continue these conversations, explore new questions. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for being here, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.